G'day, this is Jim with Sufficiency. I've been wanting to make a TV cabinet for a long time now, and I sort of had this vision of having a nice piece of live edge timber that'll go well with the wooden floors. And I went to my local timber supplier that sells cut slabs, and looking through their stock, there's some really affordable pieces of timber and some really expensive pieces. This here is Camphor Laurel, and it's relatively cheap, and it looks pretty amazing, to be honest. It's got lots of different colours in it, sort of some greens as well as the reds and orangey sort of colours and browns and things like that, and it just has a really nice grain pattern that I quite enjoyed, and the price was appealing as well. So the first step was removing the bark, because it's not the prettiest bark, and I just wanted a bit of a cleaner edge. Even though I have the unevenness of that live edge, I didn't want the bark in this case, so I took that off. And then here I'm just taking the sides back to a nice clean edge, and I cut them parallel to each other so that they'd be nice and even. Now for the frame to hold the slabs, I went with square tubing that has a rounded edge, and I wanted the design to be fairly straightforward for a number of reasons. One, I just wanted a nice clean look, but number two, I wanted it to be relatively simple to weld together, as I'm not the greatest welder, so I wanted something that was going to be relatively straightforward, so it would play into my weaknesses, if you will. So here I'm just cutting all of the pieces to make the frame, and because it was going to be such a straightforward design, sort of no angles, I wanted at least some feature to come about the frame, and you'll see later on the design I went with was a lower shelf to have the supports to be offset from the legs, and the front supports, they're offset back from the front edge, and I wanted them to appear out of the shelf rather than being on the outside of the shelf. That'll make more sense as you see it being put together. Here you can see the support being offset from the back edge. Now, in order to fix the shelves to the frame itself, I needed to be able to screw them in using wood screws. So here I'm just making a couple of access holes that I can pass the screws through from the underside and then screw into the shelf. And then this is a metal plate that I'll be cutting up into smaller tabs that can be welded to the top of the supports on the metal frame, so that I can use these to screw in from underneath into the top shelf. Now, as some keen eyes will notice, I'm not the best welder, so this is where, as mentioned before, going with a fairly straightforward design with basically just 90-degree angles, it makes it a lot simpler for me to be able to weld this, considering my lower level of skill sets in this area. But as I'm quickly learning with welding, the great thing is as long as it's a strong weld, you can cover up your mistakes or your sloppiness with an angle grinder and a flap disc. And here we go, hiding the crimes. Here's those tabs I was mentioning, just simply welding them to the top of the supports so that I can screw the top shelf to it. And then for a finish, I went with a hammer-tone Rust-Oleum product, just in black, something that would sort of hopefully disappear into the background kind of thing. Now here I'm cutting the bottom shelf square along the back edge so that it can sit up against the back posts. And this is where I begin to drill out, just using a Forstner bit, and then I'll use a router in a moment to make these square to allow the front supports to appear out of the bottom shelf. So here I'm just making a template for the holes so that I can use an edge router to clean up those holes that I just drilled with the Forstner bit. I had to be extra careful here to make sure they were perfectly aligned because steel doesn't bend very well. So they had to be absolutely perfect so that they would fit over the existing frame that I just welded up. Using the edge router here made it really simple to get a nice square pattern with rounded corners that would suit the shape of the metal legs. Here I'm just using the sander to clean up the live edge to make sure there's no bark left at all. And then I sanded the entire shells up to about 240 grit. This is the lower shelf, we're just positioning that, and the front posts will slide through those holes that I just showed you. So this is the lower shelf. You can see the screw was able to go through the access hole and then screw through the steel into the bottom shelf. Now for the legs, I used these plastic inserts. They're actually made by the steel manufacturer for this exact purpose. And I just hammered these in on each of the legs. Then I wanted to position this as best I could, and what I've done is, because the top shelf has an uneven edge because it's a live edge on both sides unlike the bottom shelf, I pushed this up against the fence on my table saw and then used the square there to align it off of that straight edge. And here I'm just using my set square to make sure the legs are the same on either side, so it's positioned as close to the middle as I can, given that two of the edges are uneven. This was the last leg to screw down, and it was just slightly out, so I got the help of my brother to hold the set square and we could position the last leg in the right spot. Now the finish I'm using is a new finish to me. It's called Osmo, and it's the type of finish that actually seeps into the timber and also produces a protective layer on top. It's from Germany. It's the first time I've used it, as I mentioned, and it was a very nice product to work with in that it used a very small amount and it goes a very long way, and the finish turned out absolutely wonderful. It feels like timber, but it feels protected as well, unlike a plasticky feeling that polyurethane can get. Here I'm just wrapping the entire unit other than the steel legs, and this is so that I can do a final spray of clear coat to protect that paint. Just one quick coat was sufficient to provide pretty good protection for the paint, which was struggling to stay on without chipping. Now the final step before installation was to put some felt pads on the bottom of the feet, as I've got nice wood floors that I didn't want to get scratched up. Even though they're plastic, you can't beat having a felt foot to protect your wood floors. You can see why I wanted to build this. Hideous TV display is now something that I'm quite proud to look at, and it's much cleaner. I'm really happy with the way this turned out. It's one of those projects that you just can't help walking past and taking a moment to look at, which is the goal, I suppose. Hope you enjoyed the video. I want to thank all my existing subscribers, and until next time, take it easy.